out to my own music. This is great.
Yeah, why not, right?
That's right. Hey, what's
You're
going
rocking
on,
out
Lou?
Captain and Tennille. Is that the phrase you want to use?
Yeah, this is I just love that song. I do. I really do. Um, so welcome to Makeup or Breakup, which we could also, you know, put a subtitle of blank or get off the pot.
There you go. Yeah.
You know, like I always tell people, when it sounds kind of pithy to say make up or break up, but the reality is if you sit and do nothing, in reality, you're making up. You're not breaking up in some ways. You're kind of there. And people think, well, I'm hanging in there. That'll make it better. Um, it's much better for everybody if I just stay and I don't leave because of the kids and things. But Lou, that's not true at all, because by sitting there, you're doing this weird thing where, yeah, okay, literally people see you walking into your house and you've got a spouse and maybe kids and a dog.
Yep.
But who are we fooling? It's so destructive for you, for your spouse, because they're clearly not getting all of you, or at least 60% of you. Sitting there and just doing nothing is the worst thing, Lou.
Right, and that's the option that a lot of people choose, because makeup or breakup both are proactive things. Breaking up is absolutely proactive. Making up, it's not. Making up is not giving up. It's not tolerating. It's not just going along and hoping things will get better. Making up is a proactive way of trying to solve, the problems between you two.
Exactly. And I think people make the mistake of just treading water. I mean, that's what I call it.
Yep.
Right. Just gonna like do a little treading of water. Just stay here. Things go sideways by the 8th to the 11th year of a marriage. That's the statistic. It used to be like they called it the 7-year itch.
Yeah.
But it's been my experience that most people really don't hit a wall until like 8, 9, 10, maybe even 11 years. And they're paralyzed by it because all of a sudden it hits them that like, this isn't that great. But then they're paralyzed because they feel like, oh my gosh, I've got a house. I don't want to leave my house. If I get divorced, I have to leave my house. I can't afford it. But what are they giving up?
Well, you have your kids, you have the house, you have your finances. Plus, by the way, there's that ever looming, I'm never going to find anybody else.
There's that
type of thing. And, it's very, breaking up is a drastic change, and humans just don't take the drastic change all that well.
Right. Exactly. And
it's the fear. What's the biggest fear for everybody?
That they'll be alone and they'll just be lonely. And they can't find another person, which is a really bad motivator for staying somewhere.
more basically, it's the fear of the unknown. The devil you know and the devil you don't know. I mean, you may be struggling in your marriage, but you know it, and you have a certain level of handling it, and you know what's going forward. Breaking up, divorce, moving forward, that's just total unknown, and few of us have all kinds of tolerance for the unknown.
Right. And the reality is, what people forget, and I feel like when I do premarital coaching, I'm so good at it because I take it to all these different levels of really, really, really having them understand through the homework that I give them, which is like, I try to do it over the course of like 2 or 3 months. And the homework really emphasizes, which I think you'd appreciate. Number one, get to know your person as well as you can. And that's why we're talking about the 1,001 questions to ask before you get married. In my coaching, I'm often asking them the different questions. I know, a lot of the pastors use these online programs where you each go and answer questions. And then the pastor, that's what they did for us, which was great. He showed it. He printed out the results for us, and he could see where we were different. And then he pointed that out, and then he pointed out where we meshed. But the key thing is taking your time to do it right. And on top of it, the thing that nobody talks about, and you'll love this, is me giving them that reality coaching of the future. So I get it. Like, you and I are really good friends. I consider, like, I could call you if I needed help. And we're pretty transparent with each other, which, a lot of people don't even do that with their spouse, never mind a friend.
Yeah.
So say we started dating, in a year, like we knew each other, and then we started dating. Well, we do feel like we know each other well, but then we're going to get to know each other better. But what we don't spend time on, and almost everybody makes this mistake. The mistake is not spending time on the future things. So I mean, I will say, like with my first marriage, the one thing I did say was, wait, before I say yes to getting married, I don't know, I was kind of a freak. I wouldn't just say, oh, thank you very much. Like,
Yeah.
um, I'm like, I just want to be sure. Two things. You want to have kids. I mean, I was pretty sure we had kind of talked about it, but like we didn't spend a lot of time on it. We were in our late 20s, early 30s. Do you want to have kids? Yes.
Mhm.
And when times get tough, do you agree to go to marriage counseling? And he said, yeah.
Oh,
But
yeah.
as it turned out, he didn't want to go to marriage counseling. He wouldn't go. He resisted it, and he felt like we can do it ourselves. I'm like, I don't know why you think that, but
Yeah.
And for months and months and months, I didn't see any change. So whatever it is he thought he was doing, it's kind of pointless if I'm not feeling it or seeing it.
Yep.
Right.
Well, the marriage counseling thing, we can do it ourselves. It's like, well, few problems are solved at the same level of thinking that created them, right? You got to get to another level of thinking. The problem I have with all this, and I've had with it the last couple of weeks, and I've just kind of evolved my position on it. The problem I have is it felt like shopping for deal breakers. It felt like shopping for things that are going to end the relationship. And I think what it is instead is learning to identify areas that you can have a discussion about, because what happens in a relationship when you're in the relationship and these things crop up, they're very hard to talk about because you're usually a tense situation. It's usually at the end of a lot of pain and a lot of blood, and the discussions are happening at a different point in your life. If you're talking about these differences beforehand, when you're both committed to the relationship, it's a little bit easier to talk about. It's a little bit easier to reconcile. It's a little bit easier to compromise on, if there's compromise to be had. I mean, hey, you may find a deal breaker, but I think people get scared of this because all they're thinking is all you're doing is fishing for a reason not to be with this person. And that's not it. It's about identifying the differences so you can work with them.
Right. Right. And I think some people feel that, we're a great couple, and when the problems come up, we're just going to tackle them.
Yeah.
When the differences come up. But the reality is, you need to be talking about futures, such as, things can change, but at this particular moment, what would you visualize your retirement looking like?
Yeah.
What would you be doing? Where would you be living?
Yep.
And that's completely legit, because it's something that people aren't always discussing with someone that they're dating, or even if they're engaged. But all of a sudden, you're 5 years into a marriage, and somehow, the parents start to go into retirement, and you turn to your loved one and say, hey, speaking of retirement, I know your parents are moving down to Florida. Like, is that something you'd want to do? Or what are you thinking? And the person goes, hell no, I don't want to live in Florida. I'd like to live up in Maine.
Yep.
And you might be thinking, yeah, I'm pretty much done with the cold weather, and I'm pretty sure it's colder up there than it is down here. So,
but it's going through the cycle of having these discussions too, because the chances are, listen, if you're 25 years old, you're not thinking I'm going to retire in Florida. Your answer is probably hell no, I'm not going to Florida. By the time you get to 55 or 60, you're thinking, I've had enough of these winters. Maybe I'd like to spend half a year in Florida, or I'd like to have a place down there. Obviously, circumstances change for everybody, but the important exercise here is being able to have these discussions.
Right, having the discussions, and also understanding the reality that whether you marry somebody at 20, 30, 40, or 50, by definition, most people, and I know people say it happens less as they get older, but most people could evolve. They could, we're constantly supposed to be working on ourselves. And who's to say that someone at age 65 isn't going to say, hey, you know what? Who knows how long I have? I want to learn how to be a downhill skier.
Yep.
And I want to do it in Vermont. And then you're sitting there with your spouse going, yeah, I don't really see myself going to Vermont so you can go skiing. But the reality is people change. And what I always teach people in the premarital coaching work is look at yourself today. Let's talk about the things that you would predict for the future, the things that you would like. But that's, a perfect example, unfortunately for me, was with my first husband. I said kids. I didn't say 2 or 3. I said kids. I felt that was sufficient. But after we had one, he felt like one was enough.
Yeah.
And he was very cautious and overwhelmed with feeling that he could give attention to a second child, which, I understand it now as an older adult, but at the time I was livid, and it really contributed to the breakdown of the marriage. It was something that it was absolutely in the top 3 reasons why I filed for divorce.
I remember having those feelings before
You know?
my son was born. I remember having the same exact feelings.
No
Yeah.
way, really?
Oh God, I was so into my daughter and just having such a great time. It's like, is there any room left emotionally for another child? You know,
Right.
I remember having those thoughts. They weren't overwhelming to me. They weren't like I didn't want to have a second child, but it was like I had those fears. Sure, what you
Right.
know, can I
It's
get
almost
attached
like-
to the second child in the same way I am to my daughter?
It's almost like, this is so perfect. Is another child going to be too much stress and too much, you know, wear and tear? But as it turned out, by the time you had the second one, did you feel like you were kind of in a groove where you could sort of get in the flow?
I had all kinds of fears and stuff before he was born, but of course, after he's born, it just happens. It's just like the concept with children. Like, for example, I had problems. I didn't want a boy. I wanted another girl. And that was dealing with concept of a child, concept of a boy. Once the boy is there, once the child is there, it's just a child, and you just take care of it and you love it just as much. And you know, the actuality of the child is so different from the concepts that you're dealing with before the child is born.
Mm-hmm.
I think, anyway.
Yeah, it's funny. I have a cousin who has 5 kids, all boys.
Yeah.
She kept thinking, not that this was the reason to keep getting pregnant, because, you know,
right.
But she kept thinking, sooner or later, I'm sure I'm going to have a girl. You know, one of her sisters never had kids, and the other one had 2 girls. So I'm like, well, the odds are you get the boys. So there's 5 boys, but they're so great. I love her kids. Yep. And I had a boy, and I was excited. I didn't want a girl because I saw what my friends were going through with their daughters. And actually, I kind of remembered me at 16 and 18 blaming my mom for everything. And I know the mommy-daughter thing.
Yep. Well, that was kind of my thing with the boy. It's like, I don't want to butt head with the boy. You know?
Right.
Like,
you were kind of like, oh, yeah, this is gonna be...
didn't turn out that way at all. We get along great, and everything was fine. But again, concept and actuality is completely different, because you change. When the child is born, you just change. You know, you just get a different approach to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now I can't imagine it, and I'm so glad I had one of both. I'm so happy for it.
Right. And I remember, you know, a couple of friends saying, you know what, you should just accidentally, you know, get pregnant and he'll be fine. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, I was just such a, I don't know, such a educated, you know, know-it-all. And I just felt like, you know, we'd gone through the women's lib stuff in the 60s, and, you know, I came along in the late 50s, but I felt that it was so unconscionable, you know, to like trick my husband into that, because I don't know, in my mind, I thought someone that's so adamant and nervous about it, this might suck. But looking back, you know, I kind of wished I'd snuck it in there, because I really think it would have been fine. I know I would have been okay with it. So it's like, I'm not looking for like 100% help here. I can do it, you know?
Well, I don't know, maybe it's my personality, but I remember going through, you know, buying the first house and just being terrified about buying the house.
Right.
You know, right up until you buy the house, having a child, the whole concept was terrifying. It's like, what am I doing? I have no,
those are major steps.
I shouldn't have a child. Who's giving me a child? That's nuts. And I remember joking with my ex beforehand, when Sarah was born, you know, when she's walking and talking, bring her to me, because I had no clue what babies were like, you know, and I never had a baby in my life. So I knew what they like, but I didn't have one in my life. So I never had any of those things. And it was completely different, because I just felt, you know, I remember the first time I held her, I was like done, you know, that was it, you know. Mm-hmm. But these conversations about what's going on in the future, because things change so much, and our positions evolve, our circumstances change. So all these things you're talking about change so much. It's more about the process of having the discussion and how you work through those things. That's the really important information to me. And I've put it on the show before. You don't know your partner till you've been in a foxhole with them. Well, you can get a little taste of a person when you're talking about something that you have 2 different viewpoints on, and how you work through that. You can get a lot of insight into how this relationship is going to be based on that. And of course, that's going to change, because, you know, when you're thinking about getting married, or when you're engaged, or when you've been dating a long time, everybody's invested in the relationship, so they'll give a little bit in that situation. 7 years into marriage, you've been battling over this particular issue for a long time. You're less concerned about the relationship. You're more about your personal interest. So that can change. But again, building the tools of having these discussions and working through them. is important, I think.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, I think the worst thing of couples who are dating is, as we've talked about, and this is why we're talking about this 1,001 questions that you need to be asking somebody while you're dating before you get married. You can have these conversations a year into dating. You don't have to wait until you're engaged. I actually recommend that you have these discussions and things, 6 to 12 months into it. If you're 6 months into a relationship and you're just doing each other, you have that consensus that you're not dating other people. This is like monogamous. Have these conversations and they can just be sort of fun. They don't have to be like horrible, but
I also wouldn't schedule it. I mean, well, it varies for different. I wouldn't sit down and go, we're going to go through a bunch of questions here.
No. But
find ways to introduce this into the discussion.
Right. So today I wanted to talk about one of the ones that we started to talk about last week toward the end. And I said, you're like the perfect wingman, because I'm like, oh, here it comes. He's talking about family and in-laws and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm working with clients, I always remind them, if you looked at a pyramid, we'll go over here.
Yeah.
If you're looking at a pyramid, the top triangle here is you and your spouse.
Right.
All right. And that is super important to remember. So I teach all my clients this, no matter where they are, whether they're dating, whether I'm working with them for their marriage and repairing it, or whether I'm divorcing them. Look at this. I'm like finally getting, because it looks opposite to me.
There you go.
So with these different layers, this top little triangle right there, that's you and your spouse.
Right.
That's not your mom. That's not your boyfriend's dad. It's
right.
not your sister, and it's not your best friend. In fact, they're down here. Up here, you have to remember at the end of the day, like you said, going into the foxhole.
Yep.
You two right there. And that is why when people talk about leaving the nest when they can, even if you have to live in the basement for a year to save money of one of the parents' houses, make it the goal that this is simply a year to save like crazy.
Yeah.
If you have to live in some cheap little studio apartment for a year after you save some money, do it.
Yep.
Because you are not fully functioning as a new couple up here if you're living at mom and dad's house. You're absolutely not.
Right.
And that's why the flip side is when I'm working with couples, I always say to people, staying in the house ideally is what we want to see, because when we're working on the marriage and you're not going to be seeing them for breakfast and things, but you're separated and you're going to see them,
right.
once a week, that doesn't help my homework assignments as well. Okay. That doesn't help as well as it could. However, once a couple separates, there's a lot of fracture and tearing apart.
Right.
Which means it's going to be harder to get back in. And what I tell people is, when you've got a couple, so little two hearts. Yeah, there we go. These are those little things, little stress balls. When you have two people that are living together and you decide that you're not doing so well, and maybe one should just move out for a little while. Okay, that's good. But there has to be, before this person goes, before Bill jumps out or Jane leaves, one of them leaves, you two have to sit down and talk with a professional like me and figure out the plan. And what most people do, Lou, is like, you know what? I don't know about you, but I don't feel like this is working right now. And I feel like if we had some separation, this would be a good thing. So what happens? Bill leaves. He goes and lives with a friend who has a couch he can surf on. And Jane's sitting here with no plan. So the plan is, great. Now I can, cook by myself. I can sleep without the snoring.
Right.
I can come and go as I want. Bill's over here. He's doing his thing, whatever. He's going to work or zooming to work from his friend's coffee table, whatever. There's no plan. That is the biggest, donkey move I've ever seen. Stay together until there's a plan. You can separate, but the plan is, where are you going to live? Don't live too far away. And we're going to be dating like once a week. You don't just say separate and I'm not going to see you for 6 months. What the hell is that? That's not even a thing. That's like pre-divorce. So what you want is to be together and come up with a plan. And the plan is, Bill, you can go to your apartment. Not yet. And the plan is, nope, not yet. We're going to see each other every Friday or Saturday night for a date. The date's going to be easy. It's going to be dinner only or a movie, something fun. we're going to text each other during the week every now and then. And we're going to have a plan for when we're going to get back together. So we're going to evaluate the separation in a month. So Bill goes out, and now Jane says, okay, so she calls him every Friday night. They go out. At the 1 month mark, Bill comes back to the house or the apartment, whatever they are. And Bill and Jane have an adult conversation. I know it's a concept, Lou. Hear me out. Lou's like, no, they don't. I'm like, I know.
Yeah.
That's why you need me.
I'm trying to figure out how many couples you run into that separate with the intention of getting back together.
Well, the problem is,
well, both of them do, because that's going to be a very rare situation. If they're both intending on getting back together or fixing the problem, they don't move out on each other.
No, usually they
usually
separate.
at least one is taking an initial step to get out.
Right. Yeah. And usually, they're both burnt out, or one is really burnt out. So the other one said, Jane says, no, don't move. And Bill's like, I just need to think straight because you bugged the heck out of me. That's great, but you need a plan. And the plan is give it at least a month and get back together and have a conversation. And you need someone like me to facilitate that, because it can go sideways very quickly, right? Actually, it probably doesn't go like that. It goes like this.
Again, you don't solve problems on the same level of thinking that created them.
Exactly, because you are the problem. Like, so why do you think you can solve it by yourselves? So now Bill goes out for a month. He comes back and they have a talk. Well, how do you feel about being separated? Do you feel like you're more at ease? Do you feel like you miss me? Like, what are you feeling? And, Jane says, yeah, actually, I like not hearing the snoring. So Bill says, okay, well, what if we look toward another month, but we work on my snoring? So now we have a list. What don't I like? Bill says, and Jane says, what don't I like? And let's work on those things. Put things down and switch the papers. And Jane has to work on her things and Bill has to work on his. So if Bill snores, get it fixed. You can fix your snoring. How do you fix your snoring? Lose weight is the first one. Almost every person that snores is overweight. I have not met, and I know they're out there, but I have not met a skinny snorer. I haven't. The other thing is there are mouth guards. You don't have to have the CPAP. I don't know if you saw the news, but the CPAPs are now showing that they cause cancer because people aren't cleaning them correctly.
Yeah.
Well, no blankety blank, Sherlock. I could have told you that. Like all the germs in a CPAP. My husband used to use one, and he used to say, doesn't seem sanitary to me. And he's like, they're fine, but he wasn't steaming it clean every morning, because who's going to do that every day?
Right.
Nobody. Who says that? Nobody. So what he ended up doing is going to the mouth guard. And we did that, literally almost this time, a little over 8 years ago. We got married in October. It'll be 8 years this October. And I was at the dentist and I said, hey, doc, do you by any chance know anything about these mouth guards that I've heard about? Because my husband's snoring is horrible. And no way in HE double hockey sticks are we bringing a CPAP machine to Europe for my honeymoon. We're not doing it. So that means I'm not going to get any sleep during our honeymoon. That's going to suck. So he said, yeah, actually, I specialize in taking the molds, sending them out, and getting them back. I'm like, all right, how long does it take to get back? He said like a week. I'm like, great. Can I get my husband in here tomorrow? He didn't even use that dentist. Can he come in tomorrow and you can do this with him? He goes, yep. And that's what we did. So you don't need the big machines. You can use a mouth guard. It almost always works. And you can also get the kits online that you create the mold and then you send it away and they send it back. He's at, I feel from a cleanliness standpoint, because I'm a germaphobe, you should get a new one every 6 to 12 months. I mean, you wash them every morning, but they get a little ick,
Yep.
But those are the kinds of things, my husband and I had to talk about, because I'm like, I felt like such a jerk. I didn't bring it up for a long time. And then I finally said, like the snoring thing is kind of a concern for me. Like, this is not a good thing.
Yeah.
When you live alone, it doesn't matter. Who cares? Nobody's going to hear you except the mice in the attic or whatever. But snoring is a bad thing. It really disturbs the other people's sleep. My uncle used to snore. He's passed away, but you could hear it down the hallway.
Yeah. Sometimes you can. Yeah.
That's like a snoring thing. But anyway, I digress because I can, because it's my show and your show. We can do what we want.
Yep.
It's our party and we'll cry if we want to.
That's right.
So I'm going to touch briefly on some of the questions that people want to ask. So before you get married, I say before you're engaged, when you think you're going to be popping the question or you're thinking that you're going to be asking or hinting for a ring, have these conversations because you need to know them ahead of time. It's not fair to the other person to say, well, geez, I didn't know that, like, I didn't know you vacation with your parents every summer, or I didn't know that,
yeah,
mom expects to come over here Christmas morning every day. Like, I didn't know that,
Yeah.
So Bill Cosby, yeah, in a book that he wrote about fatherhood,
yep,
there's a quote in there that's actually pretty good because this is about parents and in-laws. No matter how calmly you try to referee, parenting will eventually produce bizarre behavior. And I'm not talking about the kids. So,
yeah.
The whole thing with how parents do and don't get involved, how much you let them in-laws, if you're lucky, you've got great in-laws. But, making your marriage, like I said, priority number one is not without sacrifice.
Yeah.
Okay. And with only, 24 hours in a day, couples soon find that it's impossible to be all things to all people. While it's important to devote time to others, make sure to devote time to each other. So that's what we're talking about here with that triangle. Always treat your in-laws with the same love and respect that you show your spouse, but they do not they are not in that top triangle. So your parents, this is like, what each person should be thinking about their own parents. Few enter a marriage free of parents. All right. So think about these questions that you can share with the person that you're dating. Do your parents approve or disapprove of your partner? Is it important that your parents like your partner? If your parents don't approve of your partner, how will it affect your marriage? Will you or your partner look for ways to resolve this disapproval? If your parents and your partner have a disagreement, whose side will you most likely take?
Interesting question.
So these are like assessment questions that I would have a couple take before they get married.
Yeah.
Each of them answer these things honestly.
So in that last one, does it depends count? Does that work? Which side are you going to take? It depends.
Well, it does say whose side will you most likely take, right? Well, yeah, it does depend, but unless it's a life altering thing that your spouse is talking about or taking a stand on, you always support your spouse, because at the end of the day, you're no longer with your parents. They're a couple, you're a couple.
Right.
Their job was to bring you up, launch you out of the tree, right? Hey, mama birds do that. That's what I think birds are the coolest animals out there, because they just go, hey, boop, out of the nest. You can do it. You can do it, Robin.
Sink or swim. Yeah.
Here we're like, oh, Robin, I don't know if you can get out of the nest. I don't know, maybe.
Oh no. And humans, it's more like stay in the nest, stay in the nest, stay in the nest, right. More often than not. Yeah.
Right. No. We'll make a man cave in the basement for you. And then you can have you can have several rooms. So then you'll never need to have to leave. You can have a microwave in the basement.
Yeah.
You can have a mini fridge in the basement. You can have a television in the basement. So it's like, oh, great. So you've just enabled your child to never leave. Why would they leave?
And think about how interesting this all becomes when you're in you're past your first marriage and you're in your next relationship or the relationship after that. Mm-hmm. And you've got all these other factors involved. Not only is it kids, not only is it in-laws, it's like they're not even yours or they're second generation or whatever's involved. It makes it so much more complicated. Right.
Life is complicated, but it can be less complicated if you prepare your kids. So that would even be a conversation to have. Because based on your background and my background, if we were dating and whatnot, I might say, well, I'm not a fan of kicking, our kids out at 18. I think that's kind of harsh. And you might be like, really? Because, I wouldn't have considered it kicking out. I looked at it as I'm launching. I couldn't wait to go find a job, get an apartment with some friends. I mean, launching doesn't mean that you have to go have a house like your parents. Launching means you're going to start over. You're going to have an apartment with two friends. I think part of the problem is nowadays, hate to sound like this, but people are like, well, I'm not doing that because I have to have like 2 roommates. It's like, yeah, that's called like living at age 20 to 22. Like that's what people do. But people think that they should have their own apartment. I'm like, well, yay, you if you can afford it.
Well, you know why they don't want roommates is because roommates call them to task on their responsibilities, and often their parents didn't. At home, they're not called to task on these things.
Right.
In fact, they set these things. They run the show.
Right.
But in a roommate situation, you have to live with other people.
Right. And sharing is caring, and living with other people shows you different ways to love people who are different than you. It grows character and a sense of, like, I think, resilience.
Well, there's this, there are these memes out there, and the one I quote a lot because it seems to keep coming up. It's like, some of y'all have never been on a sports team, and it shows. And the ability to work in a team, the ability to work in a team environment, which is what a roommate situation is, as opposed to family. When hopefully, if it's done right, it's a team-like situation. It's not everybody for themselves, or everybody, one person having priority over the others. But a lot of people are raised these days, never played on a team, so don't understand how to work with people.
Right. It's true. And when you're on a team, you just learn to a certain degree, you're going to go with the flow. And when you're on a team, you just have to be more flexible and understand, that person has their strengths. I've got my strengths. And how do we resolve conflict? Because tomorrow, we're going on the ice together. Like, tomorrow's the hockey game.
Yep. But assuming a responsibility that isn't self-enhancing, isn't completely self-enhancing, or when you buy into the fact that being a part of a team and the team getting better is self-enhancing, that more importantly, that's what you really want to do. That's a life skill that isn't taught enough these days. Right. First of all, not a lot of people are playing team sports anymore, but you see less teamwork nowadays in general. I think maybe I'm just an old guy, yelling it off my lawn. But it seems to me that the team concept, the ability to work with other people, the ability to be responsible to something outside of yourself, like a relationship, by the way, because oftentimes I'm guessing you see in relationships that people are just tending to themselves. They don't think of the relationship as a team. They don't think of a greater good or a combined good. They're just thinking about their own interest.
Right. Exactly. And, to a certain degree, not on everything, but that's where the word compromise comes in. Yep. And like you said, like when you have roommates, there's going to be the person that's maybe kind of a slob in their room. There's one that's going to be really neat. But you can have general rules, and that's just called getting along as a team. Like, okay, wash your dishes afterward or put them in the dishwasher. End of story.
Yeah.
If the dishwasher's full, how about you run it? Like, and then come up with like, who vacuums once a week? Somebody's got to be assigned to it, because otherwise, if you don't have that,
right,
you don't have the rules of engagement ahead of time, kind of like what we're talking about now with a marriage, then you get into it and it's like, well, no, I'm not really a vacuum person, or I'm not really into like washing cars and stuff like that. This is not what I do, Or,
in interpersonal relationships, in relationships suffer from this largely, and tell me if you think this is true, because what happens in interpersonal relationships, in relationships between people, is that if one has a problem with the other one, especially a certain length into the relationship, if you have a problem with a teammate, what you're concerned about is the teammate perform and do what they're supposed to do and get better at what they're doing. You don't go, well, maybe you berate them at the beginning, but you do it from the standpoint of trying to help them get better. You don't do it from you don't do it from winning an argument type standpoint. You don't win an argument with a teammate. You help everyone get better. And sometimes that needs tough love. Sometimes it doesn't. In relationships, too often nowadays, we get to the point where you're just trying to win the argument with the other person. You're not trying to fix the problem. You're not trying to make it better for them, therefore making it better for you. You're not working together. You're just in an argument, and it's just war. One side wins and the other side doesn't.
Right. Exactly. So some other questions to ask about your parents. Who would you rather disappoint, your parents or your partner?
Oh,
what would you do if your parents?
Question.
Yeah, right. What would you do if your parents intentionally or unintentionally criticize or offend your partner? What would you do if your partner said he or she did not like your parents and would rather not spend time with them? Do your parents have a strong opinion on how you should live your married life? Do you plan on living with your parents at any time during your marriage?
Hmm.
Will you financially support your parents when they retire or if they become unable to support themselves?
Huge one.
Yep. How do you feel about asking your parents for financial support? Because what if something happens to you two once you're married?
Right.
With which family members, if any, do you plan on spending the various holidays? So, you answer these questions and share them with the person that you're dating who you think you're going to marry,
Yeah.
right? They answer these questions and they tell you what they think. Is it more important to have a good relationship with your parents or your partner? Does your partner feel that you're too attached to your parents? Would you be willing to move to a location far away from your family?
Yeah.
In general, whose advice would you most likely take, your partner's or your parents? And the last one, if you and your partner have a disagreement, will you seek solace in your parents? So it's important to ask you to answer these questions and be honest about it and let your partner know, because then your partner, AKA your soon to be engaged, boyfriend, girlfriend, they want to know like what your attachments are to your family and how you view like finances. Would you rely on your parents if you guys ran into a hard time? Would you take out a loan before you went to your parents? That way, 10 years down the road, when something happens in the marriage, your spouse isn't looking at you like, oh my God, ask your parents. They're millionaires. And your spouse says, nope, I never want to look to my parents for any financial help. And you're like, all right, that doesn't sound totally right. But, given our dire circumstances,
right.
I kind of assumed that if we ran into a problem, we might even just go to them for a loan or something, but you never know. You need to know how each other views their family. But what we're looking at here is these are kind of questions about the future too, right? Like if we run out of money, would you be, would you be comfortable going to your parents or another family member?
Yeah.
And that way you have an idea of how each other relies on each other's family. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
think of how different when you're in that stress situation in your relationship and you need her to go to her parents or you would like her to go to her parents. Think of how different that conversation goes if you're already aware of her stance on this.
Right.
In other words, you could open the conversation with, listen, I know you're reluctant to go to your parents for help, but to me, it looks like the most realistic scenario here for us. What do you think?
Right.
Without going, hey, go to your parents and just get some money. They got plenty of money. No, I'm not doing that. And then you have that fight at that point. If you have the discussion, everyone understands the positions going in later on. It makes it much easier to have that discussion, I think, or it should, hopefully.
Right. And these are the kinds of questions, again.
Plus, acknowledging that, by the way, acknowledging that with, look, I know the last thing you want to do is borrow from your parents, but we really need to consider this option at this point. Let's talk about it.
Right. And I think it's important to just have that background because you don't want to be saying down the road when there is a financial problem or your parents start to get critical of your marriage, each person wants to remember what their now spouse said their feeling was about, confiding in parents or not, how much are we using our parents. And honestly, if you and I were dating and we were having this conversation and you said, hey, would you ever consider moving? I've always been interested in making this up. I've always been interested in Arizona or Texas, or, if I could find a job in California for a year or two, or I could go back for my master's degree and go to California. Like, I don't even know that we'd stay out there, but like, I've always been curious about some of these other states.
Yeah.
And you may be like, nope, I want to live in Massachusetts for the rest of my life. That's something that we have to think about.
Oh, for me, my kids are here, but
right.
As you put it, there's two different scenarios. There's moving to California, and there's I've got a job for a couple of years here. You want to go out and live in California for a couple of years? I'd probably go, you know what? I can do a couple of years. Right. Sure, be an adventure.
It is. It's an adventure, and I think for me, I mean, I feel like finally third time's a charm. Jim is very open to traveling. He likes to travel, and he's open to getting another place somewhere, whether we sell the Massachusetts one or not. but it's interesting because before I didn't have that. I had people that were like, no, I'm living like, within an hour and a half of Boston. And of course, the irony is that my first husband, my son's dad, he ended up remarrying a couple of years after we got divorced. And a few years later, she's got him, selling their New Hampshire house, the lake house, and getting a gorgeous place in Naples, Florida. And I'm like, who is this man?
Well, things change, things change. I was that person not too long ago. I was that person in Florida. What are you out of your mind?
Right.
But now I'm thinking, geez, a couple months in Florida in the winter. Yeah, I've seen enough New England winters. I'm good. I could do that. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's some beautiful areas. Yeah. Really, there's some pretty areas. I know supposedly it's sinking. It's going to be underwater in like X amount of years, but
yeah, well,
why not while we're around?
Yeah, still wouldn't move there, but you could talk me into January and February there. I could do that.
Right.
Yeah.
So the flip side here.
Think about the difference in this conversation. I want to go back to thinking about how beforehand and how you approach somebody. And it is the difference between a greater good and winning an argument. For example, there's two ways that argument can go. And I'm guessing that whole argument about borrowing from your parents goes the other way more often than not. In other words, no, we need to borrow from my parents. Go, no, we're not borrowing from your father. Your father will lord it over to me, and we're not doing that. Right. The whole pride thing. But the conversation can go two ways. It can go, listen, I know you're reluctant to borrow money from your parents, but it seems like the most sensible thing to do at this point, especially where it's going to be short term for us. What do you think? Let's talk about it. Or the other way it can go is, what are you, nuts? They have more money than they can, than they can deal with. Of course we should borrow from your parents. You're just being crazy now. And those are two different conversations. It's the same subject, but it's about winning the conversation. It's about belittling the other person, or it's about, we got to do this as a team. Things have got to get better, right? And we got to do it together.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Exactly.
So I think building those bridges and those cycles about having these discussions beforehand, I think that's the most important part, because it's the same dispute. It's a matter of how you approach it. You tell somebody, look, I know you have a problem with this, but let's talk about it. Or, what are you, nuts? Those are two different ways to approach it, right?
Yeah.
And you're going to get, again, when someone is attacked, we talked about this several weeks ago. When someone is attacked, it's fight or flight. There's two responses: circle the wagons or retaliate. Right. So when you get into an attacking position, that's all you're going to get from the other person. They're going to shut down, or they're going to strike back. So attacking doesn't get anything done.
Mm-mm. No, actually, it ends up making it worse.
Right. Always.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you have to know how the person you want to spend the rest of your life with deals with these types of discussions and questions when you don't think the same way about something. Like you talk about, what's your relationship with your parents? Well, my parents and I don't really get along. I'm kind of happy to be out of the house. I don't like going back for holidays, things like that. And the other person is, I love my parents. I want to go back every weekend. I love spending time with them. It's home. Those are two different viewpoints. They can be reconciled, but you got to have some kind of understanding and appreciation for each other's position.
Right. And the other set of questions that I wanted to go over before we wrap up is, first, we're talking about, you're asking yourself these questions about your own parents, and then you'll be sharing them with the person you're dating. The second one is, it's understandable if you and your partner, each feel more comfortable with your own parents than with your in-laws, but you need to take an inventory on your in-laws. You need to be honest. Okay. We know that you've known your own parents all your life, but you need to get a read on your in-laws and be honest about your current feeling about them. And then you guys, either, give each other your papers with your answers, or you talk about them.
Yeah.
Right. You take on each one. So here are the questions. Obviously, like I said, each person works separately to answer these questions, and then we share with them. These are the kinds of things I do with couples before they get married, because even the pastors aren't picking this stuff apart as much as I am. So
right.
You really get to dive in and you get some real good life coaching in general, right? Do you feel your in-laws approve of you as a partner? Whether they do or they don't, how does that make you feel? Like,
Yep.
If your in-laws disagree with you, Now remember, they're future in-laws because you want to ask this before you get married.
Right.
If your future in-laws disagree with you, how would you feel if your partner did not take your side? If you were having problems with your in-laws, would you speak to them directly without consulting your partner? That might be it depends, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Should your partner be in charge of
Oh,
resolving
wait a second.
problems?
Just speak directly to your in-laws without consulting your partner?
Sometimes
No.
sometimes when you're,
Yeah.
sometimes that happens, but yeah.
Yeah.
I guess it would depends on if you're concerned about your spouse, then you might go to their parents, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, here's the question that addresses what you just asked me, little wingman. Jeez, Blue.
Well,
Should your partner be in charge of resolving problems you may have with your in-laws? That's kind of along the lines of what you're saying. Because
no, that's the same thing the opposite way. Any
Right.
problems someone has with their in-laws are a couple problem.
Right. But
And again,
generally,
some of you have never played on a team and it shows. That's a team problem. It's not
Right.
an individual problem. It's a team problem.
right. But generally speaking, when there are issues in a marriage, when in-laws have to be involved or spoken to, it's usually, especially if it's, your spouse felt insulted or something like that, rather than me going to my in-laws and saying, I just don't like the way you guys are always talking to me like that, or the way you do whatever. You always want your spouse to defend you to his or her parents.
Yeah.
Mom, even if the parents don't agree and they're like, she's making it up. Judith doesn't like it when you talk about XYZ, or Judith doesn't want the topic of ABC to come up. It's way better for the adult child to be an adult and confront their own parents and to have the back of their partner, because the first sign of a marriage going downhill is a partner not feeling supported. And, there are different ways to word it. Maybe I'm a kook. And so, Bill's got to go to his parents and say, look, I know she's overly sensitive and she gets a little crazy when the topic of whatever, drugs and alcohol comes up.
Yep.
But, she is my wife. We need to temper those conversations when we're around her.
Right.
But it didn't come from me. It should come from you.
This goes back to the number of situations in a relationship where, okay, there may be a right, you may think there's a right or a wrong, but there has to be accommodation. In other words, listen, when you guys come over the house, my wife is tremendously liberal and political discussions to go totally off the rails. So maybe we shouldn't delve into them a little bit.
Yeah.
Why trigger it? And it's not necessarily a right or wrong. It's just we've got to all deal with each other together. Maybe it's not good to talk about religion. Maybe it's not good to talk about politics. Maybe it's not good if you tell my wife how to raise our kids. You might want to back off on that a little bit.
Right. And when you see that coming, again, the child of those parents, not me with my in-laws, saying back off, it has to be my spouse. And the hard thing about that, Lou, is because of family dynamics. The reason why I want people to have these honest conversations and ask these questions, answer these questions, and share them with their future spouse, or it could be their spouse if they're newly married and already having problems, which sometimes happens. The key here is, and I know, I do run into this with people. I often have to say to people, I know this can be hard stuff. But at the end of the day, this triangle,
Yep.
You are up here, and your spouse has to feel that the in-laws and the cousins and sisters and brothers and the people at work and your friends are aligning correctly in that pyramid.
Yes.
And that your spouse feels that they are, affirmed and that they come first. Now, within reason, a spouse that says, you need to be here every night of the week. I don't like it when you go bowling with Bob, on Tuesday nights. Or, I've heard stories about people who they're married to this insecure spouse. I'm going to say woman, because that's the two that I'm thinking of, who are pacing and crying for hours while the other spouse is out bowling with their friend.
Yeah.
That's a problem. And that's a problem that a lot of people, especially if it's early in the marriage, they're trying to figure it out on their own. And the problem is that's not going away because Susie or Jane, who's pacing and crying for 4 hours because you went bowling with a friend, there's a psychosis going on there that you may not have seen beforehand. And
that's self-induced, isn't it? Those are things you get wind of before you marry the person.
Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't.
Especially if you're bowling every week anyway. Well, to your point, I guess you're right, because when people are dating, sometimes they tolerate things, but we're married now. You can't go bowling with them anymore. Is that really?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I had a client whose husband worked in Harvard Square, and he would go out for a drink or two after work, a few nights a week. Because he's right in Harvard Square, and he would go out for a drink or two with, one or two of the guys from the office. It wasn't like, this big crowd of like 10 people going crazy. It was like his business associate or like, the VP of his company. And she would be wringing her hands and pacing and crying and texting him and trying to call him the entire time. And I'm like, I'm not saying that him going out 3 or 4 nights a week was the problem, but your approach to it was also a problem.
Yeah. Well, everyone's got a part in the conflict, right? And that's the first step about resolving the conflict is understanding, listen, it may be 80 him, 20 you, but you have a part, and easing that part can help ease the problem. It's a good first step.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's very important to understand how the other person is a priority in your life and how to manage it and how to work around it. But if you don't understand the dynamic between their family, AKA your future in-laws, or your current in-laws, that's a problem.
By the way, it's insight into their upbringing, which is an insight into their personality, which is an insight with the way they deal with adversity.
Right. And sometimes, Lou, it is important to remember some of these things aren't going to change. So when we ask these questions and we listen to the answers, believe the answers.
Yep.
Don't be like, well, I thought you were kidding when you said you'd never ask your parents for money. It's like, no, I told you I'm never going to ask my parents for money. If that's someone's answer and you dig a little deeper to say, really, like never? Okay. Yep. In the future, they may break that rule, but going into it, we know that ain't happening.
All right. You've got a call to get to.
I know. So I've got to get to a call. So I just want to say thanks for sharing this video for all of you that are watching. Take it and push it out on your Facebook page because people out there need this help. And I'm a dating coach, and I'm also a marriage coach, and I'm also a divorce coach, not the same clients. So I can help people with all those 3 areas of love. So be well, be healthy, and we will see you guys next week.